We're following the Church of England's theme, God's story, our story. And for this first session, we're going to be thinking about what that very idea of story means and whether it's an appropriate way to describe our Christian faith or not. And it seems to me that really I ought to begin like this. Once upon a time, long, long ago. It's all rather cheesy, isn't it? But as a child, I was very much of the Jackanory generation. If you've never seen Jackanory, it was a television programme which aired between the 1960s and the 1990s, where a famous person would essentially just sit in an armchair and tell a story to the nation's children. You'd never get away with that now, but it was a real thing at the time, and all sorts of people participated, even including Prince Charles. If you cast your minds back, I wonder what favourite stories you may have had as children. Don't answer the question, but just have a little think. Did you have a favourite story as a child? But of course, stories are not just for children, they're for grown-ups too. And that's really important when we start to think about our faith. I still enjoy listening to stories. And okay, I'm not tuning into Jackanory anymore because that would be a little bit creepy. But I do tune in to the BBC Sounds app when I'm doing my daily workout, so that while I'm doing my boring exercises, someone is reading me a story. I've never grown out of it, and I don't think we should be ashamed as adults in enjoying the idea of storytelling. Often, I think we think of stories in terms of books, but of course they can be in many different formats. Whether you read novels, whether you watch adaptations on television, or in fact any film or soap opera or documentary or even news item which has some kind of narrative to it is a story. If you listen or watch to any of those, you are engaging with that whole sense of storytelling. So as I say, over these next few weeks, we're going to be thinking about how the Christian faith is expressed through story. We're going to hear some stories of individuals and communities and think about how the story of salvation is told both through worship and also through our own daily lives. But I'm aware that for some people, they are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of reducing the enormity of God to something as small as a story. So one of the questions to think about is how we can differentiate between, let's say, Brookside and the Bible. How do we make it clear that the tooth fairy and God are not on a par with each other? Well, first, one of the things that I would say is that story language doesn't have to be problematic or demeaning. And the telling of stories is absolutely key to human identity. We'll be exploring that a little bit more next week. And as with stories themselves, there's often more than one way of reading things. So I'm going to suggest a couple of different options when we're thinking about what story means for us. The first of those is that on the one hand, stories might be about escaping, or we could think of them as being more about mystery. What do I mean about that? Well, stories may be straightforward escapism, and certainly as a child watching Jackanory, that was part of the attraction, that it was something that took me out of my daily life. But in terms of faith, story may be about engaging with a mystery which we simply can't express in any other way because we don't have the language to talk about God as God is. In some ways, that's similar to art or music. We can experience God through the beauty of music and not really have the words to articulate it, just so with the telling of stories. So maybe the question there is whether a story or a work of art or a piece of music is an end in itself, or whether it's pointing to something else whether it's pointing to a fundamental truth about God or our relationship with God. If I watch a really good film or read a really good book, I can feel that I have been changed or transformed and that I'm a better person for it. Though, of course, as with all of us, I'm sure there are still times when I want to curl up in front of something that is purely mindless and escapist. And there's always a place for James Bond in our lives with no sense of personal growth or development through that. So we've got that idea. Is it about escapism? Is it about engaging with mystery? A second little choice for us, I think, is whether stories are things which create confusion or whether they create clarity. What do I mean by that? Well, I suppose the British in particular are especially well known for not saying what we think. We all know how we hedge around subjects and find it very difficult to give straight answers to things. You only have to imagine somebody asking you if you like their shirt when you don't. How many of us would actually say, no, it's horrible? We all come up with sort of strange things about how dazzling or different or daring it might be, but we never actually say that we don't like it. In exactly that way, stories can be used to hedge around an issue. If we don't want to give a straight answer to something, we could say, well, let me tell you a story, which may or may not illustrate it. But having said that, stories can also be about communicating in the clearest and most coherent way that we could possibly imagine. The makers of soap operas really understand this. And okay, soap operas are really about increasing viewing figures or listening figures if you're a fan of the Archers. But soap opera writers know that they can reach more people through a good storyline than any amount of government-funded advertising. We've seen over recent months and years through a whole range of different soap operas the power of characters wrestling with mental health, with issues of inclusivity, with issues of domestic abuse. All of those issues have been highlighted by people seeing characters experiencing things which reflect their own lives. And in that way, storytelling can bring a real clarity to situations. The third question, I suppose, or that third kind of choice that we've got, is wondering how far we shape a story or how far we are shaped by the story. There's an awful lot that we can learn from fiction. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience of reading a novel or watching a film and thinking, but hang on a moment, that is my story, or that's the story of someone that I know. It can happen in the most unexpected places, whether you're reading a classic novel or something more recent. I remember the first time that I read Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is a rather grim and gruesome account of a woman dealing with domestic abuse, and thinking, gosh, that is the story of someone I know. That is her story. So too, it has to be said, is A Brief History of Tractors in Ukrainian. I recognise somebody else that I know very much in that storytelling. I personally was never able to watch the sitcom Rev. Some of you may be great fans of it, but I never could because I knew those characters. I knew the man who would poo in the vicarage garden. I don't mean I knew him personally, but I knew someone who was just like him. We recognize those characters. We recognize ourselves in the story. We relate to them. And leading on from that, we can aspire sometimes to be like characters, can't we? And if you go back to that whole Jackanory beginning, think about how many children have wanted, bizarrely, to be orphans, because that's what they see in the characters of literature, whether it's Anne of Green Gables, whether it's Sophie from the BFG, whether it's Harry Potter. There's that real sense that child characters in children's novels are free from the world of adults, and other children want to emulate that. Having heroes is, of course, nothing new. It's something that we find in the oldest examples of literature, right back to classical times, with figures such as Achilles and even before that. But in the Bible too, there are heroes, people like King David, people like St. Peter. And on the one hand, they're there for us to emulate, but if their characters are drawn well, then they can also challenge us to think about their complexities. Both of those examples, King David and Peter, are figures who we might want to emulate in some respects, but most definitely not in others. Again, we think about how we might relate to them. And we can think too about the modern saints and heroes of our time. And the Dean will be exploring more of that in the fourth week of these talks. So let's just think then for a moment, very specifically about the Bible, and the Bible as a way of expressing our Christian story. Of course, it's a written text, but long before people could write, stories were being told. Within the Bible, as I'm sure you all know, we have different types of writing. The letters of Paul and the letters of other people to the early Christian communities obviously started off as written texts. That's what letters are. But in that sense, they're quite unusual because most of the Bible is very much derived from an oral tradition of words being passed down verbally from generation to generation without being written down, whether the poetry and the songs or the psalms, or the proverbs and wise words, or straightforward, simple storytelling, such as we see in the book of Genesis. But Jesus is part of that oral storytelling tradition too. The Gospels present us with someone who uses parables, stories, to engage and to teach. And if you've never seen Jesus of Nazareth and Robert Powell as Jesus himself, please do look for a clip on YouTube of his telling of the prodigal son. It's absolutely extraordinary as a way of showing how that kind of teaching and engagement can happen. But if you do watch a clip like that, it raises another interesting question, I think, about how free and easy we can be with the biblical text. Some of the disputes within the church over the centuries have been about how literally or figuratively people read the Bible. But you might want to ask the question, is it even possible to have a literal meaning in the Bible? Different biblical translations have put different emphases on whether they want to capture the language or whether they want to capture the underlying meaning. And our dramatic interpretations, such as Jesus of Nazareth, or even Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, actually reading the Bible? Or are they something different? So, how much do we control the text? How much do we control and shape the Bible? Or how much are we shaped by it? Years and years ago, I was looking for a toddler's guide to the Eucharist, as you do. And I can tell you that no such thing exists in Christian bookshops. There is, or there are some guides for slightly older children, but nothing for toddlers. However, if you want religious books for toddlers, you can find shelves and shelves in Christian bookshops full of the stories of Noah and Daniel and Jonah. What have they got in common? Animals. It's entirely bizarre and entirely missing the point. Noah, Daniel, and Jonah are all really hard-hitting theological texts about really difficult things such as sin and judgment and prophecy. So why on earth are they presented as being about cuddly lions or about fish? I really don't know. So we've got some health warnings and we need to think about how we relate to the Bible. What we can say, though, just to wrap up, is that the Bible and the story of the Christian faith are things which are really big. There is metaphor in the Bible, of course, but it's about much more than metaphor. And the Christian story begins with creation, but it ends long after us. The Christian story is something which is living and evolving and continues through our lives and beyond, way, way beyond any written text. Which leaves us, I think, with a challenge of how we hear the story of faith and how we tell the story of faith in a way which is helpful to ourselves and to other people, and to what extent we can continue that story of faith as we live out our own lives as disciples.